Alright, so we're just going to start proximally and work distally. We always go through the same set so we don't forget things. So we start with shoulder flexion. We should be able to come up 180 degrees. And the one thing we always want to remember is we want to keep out of internal rotation. So you're going to slightly externally rotate here as we come up into shoulder flexion. The other end of this motion is shoulder extension, and it's not as often a problem, but certainly something we want to make sure is not limited, and if it is, we would work on improving. So you can do them together as part of the same continuum, shoulder flexion and then extension, or you can do them individually the way I did initially. Shoulder abduction, you still want to make sure you're abducted some. And that's why I like to hold here, because I can control your humerus and make sure it's abducted. Excuse me, make sure it's externally rotated. But I can also control your forearm with these fingers so this isn't falling down and hitting you. Because when you're working with students, you're automatically going to keep your hand from doing that. But if your client is flaccid and they don't have the control, it's going to fall down and hit them if you're not controlling that. And the more that happens, the less stable they're going to feel. They need to feel like they can completely relax and let you stretch them, or you're never going to truly be able to stretch all the musculature. Okay. So we have shoulder flexion and extension. We have abduction and adduction. We also want to do horizontal adduction and abduction. Then we're going to work through rotation. So typically the easiest way to do that is to flex the elbow to 90 degrees. External rotation here and internal rotation. So we just want to be rotating around this axis. Alternately, you can hold the arm here, come into external rotation and internal rotation. So you haven't changed anything for the rotation. The only thing you've changed is whether your arm is neutral here or you're in 90 degrees of abduction. But the rotation, it's around a different axis, but it's really the same motion. Alright, so that's shoulder. Once we get to the elbow, it's pretty simple. It's a hinge joint, so you only have 1 degree of freedom. You've got flexion and extension. And extension is the one that's more typically limited. So obviously we're paying attention to the end range of all of our motions, but you certainly want to make sure you get extension. And the one problem you run into is if you're not sitting on the edge, if you're sitting in the middle of the bed, which most of our clients are, as we come down, the bed will stop us from getting those last couple degrees, and those last couple degrees are important because if you lose a couple degrees, within a couple weeks you'll probably use a couple more, and then it can start this negative cycle where you all of a sudden you miss 30 degrees of motion because we kind of got lazy and didn't really get full extension from the beginning.
So what would it look like in the middle of the bed?
As we come into extension, it's going to look like we're getting extension. But if you pick the arm forward or you pull it out to the side, you realize you can get a couple more degrees.
Okay.
So it can be misleading and it's not always that clear.
Okay.
So elbow is easy because you just have those two motions, flexion and extension. And then working distally, we come to the forearm. So we're working at the PRUJ and the DRUJ, or the proximal radial ulnar joint, and the distal radial ulnar joint. And we never want to put all of this torque through the carpus. So we don't hold at the hand, and we don't hold through the carpus. We want to make sure that we find the radial styloid and the ulnar styloid and make sure that we are proximal to it. Okay. So the radius is what's flipping over the ulna. There's a couple ways to do this. You can just turn it over like that, and what you don't want to do is allow this person to work from the shoulder. So I like to keep this in nice and close to the side. Another way to do it is just to put your hands like this. That's a little easier to roll. Again, it looks like my hand is down here distally, but my force is coming above or proximal to the carpus. The reason I have my fingers down here is so that this isn't, again, if they're flaccid, this
You're
isn't
not
flopping all
flopping.
over, because eventually that's going to get sore through
Yeah.
the wrist. Alright, now we're at the wrist, and we just work on extension and flexion. So we're always stabilizing proximal to the joint and then moving distal to it, so I'm just using the metacarpals to create that motion. What you don't want to do is get your fingers involved at the same time, because tightness in the finger extrinsic musculature can limit wrist motion, and then we're just not being specific. So if we want to get the joint, we need to let the fingers relax and just work at the wrist. Can also work into radial deviation and ulnar deviation here. So radial deviation is less motion. Ulnar deviation is more, which makes sense because functionally, if you think about it, every time you're reaching for something or holding something or carrying something, we're often in an ulnar deviated position. So it makes sense that we would have more of it. Alright, then we get to the fingers and we can do those compositely. We want to make sure we're getting the eyepiece flexed fully, and then the M piece flexed, and we don't want our fingers to be in the way, so often we have to slide those out of the way. And then when we come into extension, it's easy just to flip your fingers around the tip of the clients to come into extension. This also lets you use each finger individually to go as far as each one needs. Some fingers will stretch more than others. Once we have the fingers in, we can look at the thumb. So we have flexion and extension. The key with these, with most of the thumb motions, is to remember that the CMC is where the motion is primarily happening and that we want to focus on. So when we do flexion and extension, we can flex the IP and the MP. We need to make sure that we're getting the CMC as well. And then when we come into extension, what we don't want to do is extend distally and then pull up, because we tend to hyperextend the MCP, but not get enough excursion in the CMC.
Okay. Let's see.
So we'll come into flexion this way, again making sure we get good motion at the first CMC joint, and then even though I'm holding with my fingers here distally, my motion is coming proximally from the metacarpal to pull you into extension, and then I get the MP and IP. So that's flexion extension. Then we have abduction, which is just coming perpendicularly out from the palm. Again, my fingers look like I'm holding here, but my motion is actually coming from down here at the metacarpal. And then we want to do opposition, which is a combination of flexion, extension, and then rotation. So we want to make sure we abduct and then come over, and again we're working from the CMC joint, and then we can add in the MP and IP to flex to the crease at the 5th MCP joint. Then we come back again working from the CMC joint. So that's your upper extremity passive range of motion.